Hi, my name is Sebastian Girner. I'm the editor-in-chief of TKO Studios, and I'm calling from Brooklyn, New York, and I just stepped into the Vactorverse.
I am Vactor, and this is the Vactorverse. Today on the show, I have a very special guest, Sebastian Girner, the editor-in-chief of TKO Studios. He's also the writer and editor of Scales and Scoundrels, the father of all things, Tales of Terror, all for TKO Studios. For over a decade, this German-born, American-raised writer and editor has developed, produced, and creatively guided best-selling and acclaimed comic fiction for Marvel, Image, Viz Media, Kodansha, and Random House. He is an extremely pleasant person. I'm sure you will agree. Sebastian, welcome to the Vactorverse.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. I am very excited to speak with you today because TKO has been on all of my social media feeds. Every time I turn around, there's on TikTok, on Twitter, on Instagram, I'm seeing TKO. And so I was very interested, and I checked out Sentient, and I saw some other Sarah and some other great titles. So I was like, oh man, this is a great opportunity to talk to an up and coming publisher on the rise. So thank you very much for joining me today. I really want to get to talk about TKO, but first, before I talk about TKO, let's talk about Sebastian. What is your comic book origin story? What got you into comics, and what kind of hooked you for life?
So my origin story is my life story. Got to go all the way back. As you prefaced, I was born in Germany in 1985. So ancient by some of your listeners' metric probably. But my family moved to the States when I was very young, 3 or 4. And I believe that, my parents were concerned or had some concern about my learning, English and having access to the language here. So they always kind of made sure that there was reading material and English language stuff around. And again, it being the 80s, the newspaper strips were still a big thing. So I was obviously drawn to comics and in the newspapers the way all children are and still are. And Calvin and Hobbes was kind of the thing that I was really, really drawn to, because it was a little boy with a stuffed animal, and I was a little boy with a stuffed animal. So I learned how to read English with comics, with the strips. And then of course I would get the collections, and then of course you were in a bookstore or at the time, getting comics. So that was kind of, I was reading strips all the time, Peanuts, Snoopy, Calvin and Hobbes always. I even read Garfield just because when you're a child, you're not that discerning.
Yes.
Gonna get hate from some Garfield lovers out there. But and at some point, it's now the early 90s. I was, I remember this because I was doing chores, or my allowance was $5 a month, and a comic book, a Marvel comic, was $1.25. With $5 would get you exactly 4 comics. And as it so happened, I purchased the 4 Spider-Man comics that were monthly at the time. So that was the Amazing Spider-Man, the Web of Spider-Man, the Spectacular Spider-Man, and just Spider-Man, all by different writers, different artists. And that was my Marvel universe. Like, I didn't know other characters existed unless they were guest stars in the Spider-Man. I also didn't understand that you're supposed to just read I thought it was one big story.
Oh, yes.
So I would leap from Spectacular Spider-Man or Web of Spider-Man, which was drawn by Sal Buscema, which is just gorgeous, but very, very distinct style. And then The Amazing Spider-Man, which was the flagship title, was drawn by Mark Bagley at the time. This was right after, I believe, Todd McFarlane came off the book, because they went over to Found Image.
Gotcha.
So I was kind of in this tumultuous, the 90s and superhero comics were very tumultuous, but I didn't know any of that, because I was just I just really dug Spider-Man. Then I moved back to Germany, mid-90s. So I'm 13, 14 now. The Marvel kind of comic book stuff ended, because now I was back in Germany, Europe, and there the comics scene was a lot more inspired by the French comic book scene next door.
Yes.
So I started reading, the Franco-Belgians and Asterix and Tintin, and got into that. But also, this is the mid-90s now. Manga had just started popping off in, again, France primarily first, because they were always kind of early adopters of other comic book cultures. But then that happened. There's this 1 or 2 summers in Germany. I was in high school where everyone was reading Dragon Ball because they had just started coming out in these, like in the Tankobon. Like everyone, it completely floored, all of us, because I was always like the guy that reads comics in school, but then for a brief second, everyone was reading manga, and I was like, look, they're awesome, and they're like, yeah, but these aren't comics, these are manga, it's different. Like, you don't understand. I was like, I don't understand. Like, I've been reading this stuff since I was born. And that kind of actually put me on the scene of then studying Japanese and kind of indulging in my, love of manga specifically. And I went to university, went to Japan, lived and studied there for a bit, and just kind of devoured all of these manga that, that still have not, for all the glut of manga that have been, published and distributed all across the world. They have even more there that for one reason or another just won't be distributed. So it's always, it's an endless, pool to dive in. And that brings us to the tail end of my extremely long-winded origin story, is that I've always been surrounded by comics and always loved them and read them, but I was always exposed to like different winds and different cultures, and that kind of informed my love of so many different kinds of comics and what all they can do, because they were always there for me at certain times in my life. When I was a kid, I grew up reading the strips, and then I got into the superhero stuff, and you sort of outgrow it. All throughout the 90s also, Vertigo Comics was coming up and kind of, right at the time, 16, 17, where you're like maybe a little more curious about, more mature themes and more like kind of underground goings, and then you might want to, put down the superhero stuff and pick up those books. But then ironically, all of those writers went and did superhero stuff, but kind of like aged it up and made it really, dark and grim. Like I followed Garth Ennis around all throughout his career. All the way up to working with him on Sarah for TKO, which is of course a huge deal for me. Because I grew up, I first time I met him when I was still at Marvel, I told him I used to cut class just to read your comics, and he was like, "Oh, that's not. I mean, that's good, but like you should have stayed in school." And I was like, "Ah, it's okay." He's a lovely person. But yeah, after university, I started, sending out resumes the way you do, and I always thought that I would go back to Japan, and I had a doctor thesis I wanted to kind of investigate and write. Would also have been about a certain manga. But a friend of mine who actually a friend of my, he went to college with my sister's now husband, then boyfriend.
Gotcha.
Was Pornsec Pishishot, then an editor at Vertigo Comics, now a writer of many fine books. Infidel, The Good Asian, just won an Eisner, so also has made his way through comics. He knew me through my sister and like I said, her that boyfriend. And he suggested I should send my resume to Marvel Comics because, in retrospect, he knew that they were going through some editorial changes at the time, and there might be some openings for assistant editors, and he thought that I would have been a good candidate. And lo and behold, they asked me for an interview because I was just in New York at the time. I was still living in Germany, but I was over here visiting my sister who had stayed here. So it's this whole like hodgepodge back and forth. And then they hired me, and I moved to New York 14 years ago, 2008. And I started my work at Marvel as an assistant editor. And I think 6 weeks or so into that, the economy collapsed in the 2008 crash, and Marvel like instigated a hiring freeze. So at that point, I was kind of like, uh-oh, I just got onto the barge before like, they burned the dock.
Right.
And that started my kind of job as an editor in comics. I was at Marvel for 4 years, after which I left and pursued a number of other kind of comics adjacent, jobs. I started doing translation work a little bit for manga for Kodansha. And then I started around that time, I started doing freelance editing, which was not really a thing done to that extent before. There's always been kind of freelance editors, but like a full-time freelance comic book editor, there had to be like a confluence of things that were happening at the time. This is 2012. Marvel and DC, I'm sure, also was coming to a point where the direct market, which is always undergoing various convulsions, but you had seen a lot of creator-owned books published through Image doing really impressive numbers, and that created kind of an exodus almost for certain creators from Marvel who had made their name at Marvel and DC, who drew an audience, not necessarily just because they were writing, these Marvel or DC characters, but because specifically they were writing them. So, writers like, I would end up working with Rick Remender a lot, all of his Image titles at the time, from Black Science through Deadly Class, Low, Tokyo Ghost. But also like Kieran Gillen, you saw, Jason Aaron, Marjorie Liu. So there were a lot of writers and artists who were, doing Marvel and DC work, but all of a sudden realized, oh, actually creator-owned, again, the Image resurgence that kind of happened in the early aughts there. And all of those, a lot of those writers and artists were in the market for a freelance editor, someone who could give them the kind of structural or guidance, to write and draw a monthly comic, because obviously an editor is your, creative partner ideally, but they also offer a lot of services to writers and artists that don't involve like the full creative, but it's just like doing schedules, doing deadlines, cracking the whip a little bit once the book is done, making sure it gets lettered, making sure all the files are the right spec, and setting up marketing and previews and all that stuff, like all the many, many small things that an editor can do to assist in the creation of a book. And me having done that at Marvel quite intensely, because as an assistant editor, you're running a lot of books from soup to nuts. There was just kind of a muscle memory that I could step in and do this on my own time and on my own dime. So I ended up doing that for a number of years. Again, all of this is like not a master plan. This is me literally just kind of like doing the work that's in front of me and knowing that I love comics. I want to keep doing them. It's also around that time that I started writing. So my partner and good friend Jody LaHoop and I, that's around the time we started writing Shirtless Bear Fighter. And I started putting down the roots of what would become Scales and Scoundrels. And then I got a call around 5 years ago from who would become the publisher of TKO Studios, Ziet Chun, who is a writer and director in Los Angeles, came up through indie film, but had always been like a comic book fan and a reader. Like he was the one in Hollywood who for the longest time was like, oh, he's the writer director who like actually reads comics, as opposed to, so he would get all of these calls like, we have a comic book script, we just optioned it, we don't know what to do with it. You read comics, you give it a pass. And he's just like, all right. And he was kind of in a position to, he was exploring along with his partner and our co-founder, Salvatore Simeone, like exploring the idea of like founding a new type of comic book company and what would that even look like. So they were talking to various, professionals and editors in the scene, and we hit it off because I could bring kind of the sight from both sides of the divide, like work for hire, creator owned fully, what are the ups and downs of each side. And that was how we were able to kind of found TKO as like a third leg somewhere in between the two that we thought was kind of necessary for a vibrant industry, because just it's always good when there's more options for creators out there. Marvel and DC are always going to be there. They're going to outlive all of us. Those characters are going to be around forever. And Image on the opposite end of the spectrum is, of course, an incredibly important publisher, just by the virtue of that they are fully creator owned, that they allow 100% ownership. But there's also certain challenges of just being a creator for a creator-owned comic. You are 100%, responsible for the whole production. That's where an editor can come in. And it was interesting for us to try to position TKO as something that not just like was cognizant of those challenges for creators, but also for retailers, for readers, like the entire ecosystem of comics as they exist, and to try and do something that also kind of moved us a little, like moved comic books and their creation and how they're positioned in pop culture right now into the 21st century. So it's been a really wild ride. Like this is my, 14th year or 15th year doing comics professionally. And I genuinely, every single year that I've done this, I had a feeling that this is like my last year. Like this might just all be over. And at some point, like, in the last couple of years, I was like, I think I'm good. Like, I think I can do this. It's comics is a strange mistress. Like, it always feels like you're just barely keeping afloat. But after a couple of years, it's just, I guess this is just how it's going to be.
Nice, man. That is a fantastic origin story, and actually, there's a lot of parallels to my life. I lived in Japan. My dad was in the Air Force, so I was on a couple of different military bases. And then after college, I went and studied abroad in Nagoya for a little bit, and so I had a ton of manga and Dragon Ball influences, and then came back around the same time. So yeah, and actually my dad was in Germany for a little bit as well, so I kind of visited him over there. So
a lot of army bases there as well. Yeah,
a lot of
super interesting.
Yeah, that is great, man. But I love hearing people's different origin stories of how they got into comics and how they kind of moved and ebbed and flowed through the industry. But yours, the difference between me and you is you're successful in comic books and I'm making YouTube videos. But that is fantastic. I really like the way your origin story, how it plays out. Now, could you tell me about TKO Studios for anyone who is maybe they've heard the name or they're a little bit familiar with it? Can you kind of give us a background on TKO?
Yeah, absolutely. So TKO Studios was founded we launched in 2018 November. So we're coming up. This is what would be our 5th year.
Man.
And the initial, it was wild because we've been working on it for some time. And now, I mean, even thinking back, it's only been 5 years, but it's just like the Wild West. Like we're, as a company, you grow, you expand, you become more established. And since then, other publishers have come out. So the new car smell is off a little bit, but it's been really, really interesting because the founding principles of TKO were very strong. And we always wanted to do like new takes on established genres, like kind of not service superhero comics, which are just, we love them, but there's so many of them.
Right.
And to put creators in a position where the monthly grind, we take the edge off of that. So when we announced, there was no preamble, there was no kind of like, oh, we're launching in 6 months. It was like we launched, I think, almost like fully on Twitter. We're like, hey, we're TKO. Hey, we're new. Here's 4 books. You can buy all of them right now. Here's a link.
Nice.
And we launched with, one of our launch titles was Sarah by Garth Ennis and Steve Epting. And those two had not been paired before, even though they're kind of like a perfect pairing.
Yeah.
And it was just absolute, you want to, if you're like launching a comic book company, you want to kind of have a flagship title. And Sarah was a great one because it drew a lot of eyes because both Garth and Steve were, of course, very established. But it was also like a different, like Garth has done a ton of World War II stories, but this one was unique in the sense that it was set on the Eastern Front. And it's an all-female Soviet sniper brigade, which were based on historic fact. And Steve also at the time, this was one of those kind of like Hail Mary plays where we were looking for an artist. And I was like, well, kind of want to kick the door down. There's plenty of artists who can do a story like this, but you also want to, as a new publisher, you want to really kind of flex a little bit. And I reached out to Steve. I had edited one title of his at Image. So I had literally just had his email, and I reached out and I was like, hey, I'm assuming you're busy because they always are. But here's this project I'm working on with a new publisher. And he was like, oh, this is actually great. Like I've got a hole in my schedule and I can always go ask for work at Marvel or DC and they'll always give him work because artists like that are always going to be working. But he was interested in working with Garth and he was interested in that story.
Nice.
And so it was just this little bit of luck that ended up, creating a title. And then I think it was just the kind of a bit of braggadocio that we had, that it was, it's not like to readers, we were coming out with like exciting titles with new artists and both established creators and new artists, different types of genres. We had Sarah, which is World War II. We had a book called The Seven Deadly Sins, which was actually written by our publisher, Z Chun, with an artist named Artyom Trakhanov, who's incredible. I'd always wanted to work with him. And he drew like the gnarliest, like real Wild West, like everyone's kind of ugly and sunburned and like just, like really, really great stuff. and like an action adventure set in like the 20s called The Fearsome Dr. Fong with Dan McDade, and then a book called Goodnight Paradise by Josh Dysart and Alberto Ponticelli, which was a kind of neo-noir crime thriller set in the homeless population of Venice Beach, which was also incredible. It was like a book that Josh, who I also knew through my work in comics, had like wanted to write for, I think, like 10 years. I've heard about him pitching this book to different publishers, and no one really had the time. So it was very, very proud, you know, for TKO to kind of take that leap and put this book out that was really, you know, near and dear to the heart of a writer. So it was kind of us stepping out and saying, here we are, these are the types of books we want to do, and here's how we're going to be putting them out. We're going to be putting them out binge release. Basically, you can purchase them once. For retailers, that's great because they kind of only need to sell the book once. You know, they can be like, hey, you're looking for something new, because comic book retailers are like any hobby specialty shop, you know, or wine store or vinyl or records, what have you. Like, they know their clientele, they know their customer base. They're going to come in every Wednesday, probably for their Marvel, for their DC books. They'll pick up a couple of Image titles, and maybe they'll come in on a weekend and be like, hey, I'm looking for something new. You know, like the new Spider-Man is not out yet. What you got? And they were like, oh, if you want a Western, here's this thing. And if you want to, you know, something else.
Yeah.
And because they only need to sell it once, we thought that that was a good rate, and it kind of like put it out across the board. You could buy the trade paperbacks, buy the box sets. We put them out digitally as well. And then we followed that up the next year with another, you know, kind of breakout title with Sentient by Jeff Lemire and Gabriel Walta. That was, you know, a stunning book and a huge runaway success. And of course, Jeff and Gabriel have been working together many times since then. So it was also nice to kind of be a matchmaker in those regards. But since then, you know, this was 2019. So right after that, of course, COVID struck, and that's where we were in a position to do something interesting, because we were our own distributor from the start. Didn't go through Diamond Comics, which now, as actually their monopoly has been broken up a little bit, also because of COVID and the effects in the industry. But because we weren't distributing through them, when they had to actually shut down operations in the early months of the pandemic, we were able to continue to ship books because we sold them directly to customers. But we were able to basically set up that if you purchased TKO books on our site, you were able to tag your local comic book store in the drop-down menu at checkout. And then what we initiated is that we would send that store the share of that purchase that they would have gotten had you purchased that book in the store.
Oh, wow.
So it was just this very kind of new and interesting way that we were able to kind of look at the industry, look at what was happening through no one's fault. COVID, you know, came down on all of us, and to be able to pivot our way of doing things to benefit, you know, the retailers, the readers, and just kind of try to do our small bit in keeping the comic book community vibrant and keep people reading, keep people buying stuff, and supporting their local shops, a lot of which are just, you know, run by people who love comics and who have to swim in between the streams of these publishers and the general economic winds, which are, for reasons we don't want to get into, always kind of blowing against you when you're doing something that you love and something that is art, but also, of course, needs to, you know, get people paid and keep rents going and make sure that when people have a drop box, you know, a pull box, that they can come and pick them up and all that stuff. So all of those small ways in which TKO kind of looked at the way comics have been created, marketed, sold for the last 20, 30 years, and saying, hey, there's some new tools in the toolbox that you can use. You can use e-commerce, you can use, you know, obviously social media, like you mentioned, to try and put the books, and by extension, everyone, you know, connected to them, creators, marketers, retailers, readers, in a better position to enjoy the comic and just kind of clear a path to the comic and not have to go through so much, you know, kind of rigmarole to get there.
Yeah, man, that's fantastic. And I think it was during the pandemic when I first heard of, and I think Sentient was the first title that I heard of, and just like I said, the social media of, I'm seeing it every day on my feed, and I'm like, TKO. I'm like, man, I got to check out TKO. So yeah, it's been really interesting to follow the journey and where it is now. And I want to promote and push it as much as I can, because I love the studio and I love everything that is coming out. Is there anything on the horizon that you got cooking that you can share with us? Any TKO things coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. This year we have a bunch of releases. We're still kind of rolling up. The interesting thing about TKO is that no matter when someone kind of discovers it, a lot of our books are sort of evergreens. So anyone who is listening now for the first time, Sarah, Sentient are two of our perennial favorites. But, I encourage everyone to kind of look at the slate of our books and know that when you're purchasing one, you're getting the full story. It's not like you have to come back in, a week or two and remember to put in an order code for this thing. Like, it's kind of like a one-time, get into a good story. In April, so just in a couple of weeks, we're releasing two of the first titles of this year. The first one is called The Witches of World War II, which is a historically semi-accurate account of a coven of witches that were employed by the British Secret Service to combat the Nazis, because the Nazis were incredibly fascinated by the occult. The second in command, Rudolf Hess, was a bona fide occult practitioner, believer. If you've seen any of the Indiana Jones movies, you kind of have an inkling for this. But the writer, Paul Cornell, is a longtime comic book writer and wonderful comic book creator. Stumbled upon this very fascinating true life history of a woman named Domini Valiente, who was one of the founding mothers of Wicca, of the modern Wicca movement.
Oh, wow.
And that she, and in the story, this is a quasi-history, she and Oliver Crowley, the most famously self-monikered most evil man alive, are essentially hired to put together a task force of all of them are real life historical figures from the realm of like British witchcraft and the occult, to basically make the Nazis believe that there is a groundswell of pro-Nazi sentiment in the British population, and that they could overthrow Churchill and the British government. And that worked to the degree that Rudolf Hess got on a plane in Germany, flew to Scotland, and parachuted down, believing that he would be welcomed as a liberator and conqueror of the British Isles, which of course was not the case.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really interesting story. It's a World War II story, but it's very much kind of set on the home front. And it's about, for me, it was a story about like the many ways in which you can combat fascism, even in the silliest corners where like on the British side, they're like, everyone knows this is garbage. Like this is witchcraft, it's just trite. They believe it though. So that means that it's a weakness. Like we can use this. And of course, also explores the meaning of these very deep held belief systems, Wicca and witchcraft, of course, having roots all the way back to pagan, pre-Christian era, UK, England. And there's a lot of interesting characters there, but it felt like an important kind of book to do at the time. The artist is a really wonderful Italian artist named Valeria Borzo. It's not quite her debut work, but she's pretty young and up and coming, and we did a wonderful job. Colors by Jordi Belair, so that's a really exciting read if you're into historical fiction and also want to see some witches kick some Nazi butt. And then the second title is called Sacred Lamb. This is by Tim Seeley and an artist named Yelena Djurdjevic, and this is we call it a meta slasher, but it's ostensibly, if you took the kind of mythology of slasher films, Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers, Scream, back in the news again, is that you have this, now very well-known trajectory of mythology where you have the final girl and you have the slasher killer. And in this world, slasher killers are real. Their final girls are real. And rather than try to solve the problem of the slasher killer, the government has a clandestine, basically secret town where they take the survivor girls and just sequester them, because they're afraid that if they keep them around in society, the slashers will just keep coming back from the dead and keep murdering people. So we have our lead-in character, Kellen West, who's kind of a social media influencer. She manages to survive her own slasher killer, of course, ends his life, as all good final girls do, and is then picked up by essentially the military police and are like, okay, you have to spend the rest of your life in this community compound where the only other, inmates you have are all these other final girls from throughout this world's history. Ooh. So from the very first kind of late 60s, when the slasher film was kind of coming up. So it's this very fun. And then, of course, spoiler alert, having all the final girls in one place makes it really, really convenient when all the slashers come back at the same time and descend on this poor town, because all of the eggs are in one basket, as it were. So it's really fun. Tim Seeley, obviously, a writer who has a long, long history and has an incredible well of knowledge of horror, and also not just the joy of horror, but the joy of the audience knowing the rules that the movie also, or the comic also knows. And I'm a big horror buff myself, so we had a really, really good time kind of going through the history of horror films and creating all of these final girls from all of these different kinds of slasher films throughout, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up through, the way that genre in specific has been so adaptable to the time, where you have these really from Halloween, the original kind of 70s trite exploration of suburban Americana, to the 80s, where you have stuff like, Slumber Party Massacre and Driller Killer and all these kind of outlandish, movies that imbibe the 80s, the blood splatters mixed with cocaine and neon. Back into the 90s, when you have, the meta thing is starting. Wes Craig is a comic book artist. Wes Craven did Scream, all the way up into the aughts. We have French Extreme coming in, which blew everyone's mind with how gory it was. So that's really fun. That's obviously something for horror fans, but also something for, if you've ever read the wonderful Men, Women, and Chainsaws, the kind of book that established the invisible rules of this world, and how these slasher movies, which are all about big scary men with knives murdering women, are actually very subversively feminist, and have a lot to say, ironically, about power structures in our society and in art. So very, very cool stuff. And those are the two titles coming out in April that I would like to showcase.
Nice. Man, I can't wait. I will be there when both of those titles come out, and when all of the future TKO stuff comes out, and specifically anything that Sebastian puts out. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be supporting you, sir. It was an excellent talk that we had today. I'm very happy that you're able to join us here in the Vactor verse. Just much future luck and success to you, as well as to TKO. I'm going to have all the links down below to Sebastian, to TKO, where you can get all of this stuff that we talked about today. And I really want to thank Sebastian for joining me. You were an excellent guest today, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. Well, I want to let everybody know that Sebastian loves comics, and you should too.